The scream of twisted metal against stone echoed across the valley like the death cry of some iron bird. And in that moment, Marian Blackwood knew her quiet life was about to shatter like morning frost. She pressed her palm against the kitchen window, watching black smoke spiral from the tree-line beyond their wheat field. The crash had shaken the very foundations of their stone cottage, rattling the china her grandmother had brought from the old country. Her father would be in the fields now, tending to the harvest that meant survival through another brutal winter. Her mother lay upstairs, caught in one of her darker spells, speaking to shadows that danced only in her fevered mind, which meant Marianne was alone to decide what came next. The smoke grew thicker, darker. You could taste it on the autumn air, metal, and fuel and something else, something that made her stomach clench with dread. She grabbed her father's heavy coat from the peg by the door, her fingers trembling as she worked the brass buttons. The war had come to their doorstep at last. After 3 years of distant thunder and rationed bread, the brambles caught at her skirts as she pushed through the undergrowth, following the scar of broken branches and scattered debris. Pieces of what had once been an aircraft lay scattered like deadly confetti. A propeller blade buried deep in an oak trunk, twisted metal gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. The acrid smell of burning fuel made her eyes water. She found him in a clearing, where the machine had finally surrendered to gravity. That he lay crumpled beside the wreckage, his uniform torn and darkened with blood. One arm bent at an angle that made her wince, his face pale as birch bark beneath a shock of dark hair. But it was his breathing that caught her attention, shallow, labored, like a wounded animal fighting for each precious breath. Marian knelt beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly over his still form. The uniform was unfamiliar, not the rough wool of their own soldiers, but something finer, with insignia she didn't recognize. A pilot, certainly, but from which side of this endless war? His eyes fluttered open, pale blue like winter ice, and fixed on her face with startling intensity. "Bit," he whispered, the foreign words sliding from his lips like a prayer. "Hilf." German. Marianne's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She rocked back on her heels, her mind racing. A German pilot. Here, in their valley, where the war had been nothing but distant gunfire and worried whispers in the market square. The enemy, crashed and broken not 50 yards from her family's home. She should run. Should fetch the constable from the village, or better yet, the home guard. This man, this enemy, could be anyone. A reconnaissance pilot gathering intelligence on their defenses. A bomber who had rained death on innocent families. A killer who would slit her throat the moment he regained his strength. But as she watched, a single tear traced down his dirt-stained cheek, and something in her chest cracked open like an egg. "Please," he whispered again, this time in accented English. I don't want to die." The words hung between them like spider silk, fragile and catching the light. Marianne found herself studying his face, really looking at him for the first time. He couldn't be much older than her own 22 years. His features were sharp but gentle, aristocratic in the way of men who had never known hunger. But there was something else there, something that made her think of her younger brother Thomas, who had marched off to war with such bright certainty and never returned. Fear. This enemy pilot was terrified, just as Thomas must have been in his final moments. "I should leave you here," she said quietly, testing the words. "Let the authorities find you." His eyes closed, and for a moment she thought he might have lost consciousness again. Then, "Yes, you should." The simple acceptance in his voice undid her completely. Marian glanced around the clearing, calculating. He was tall, probably too heavy for her to move alone. But if she could get him conscious enough to walk, if she could support his weight. The old root cellar behind their cottage had been unused for years, its entrance hidden by overgrown rose vines. Her father wouldn't think to look there, and her mother rarely left her bedroom these days. "Can you stand?" she asked, already knowing. She had made her choice. That he tried, struggling upright with her help, but his injured arm wouldn't support his weight. He sagged against her, and she caught the scent of him, leather and soap and something indefinably foreign. Not unpleasant, but different. Other. "The cellar," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I can hide you there, at least until..." Until what? Until the war ended? Until his people came looking for him? Until her father discovered her treason and cast her out into the wilderness? Why? he asked as they struggled through the brambles. His weight heavy against her shoulder. It was a fair question. Why risk everything for a stranger? For an enemy? Marian didn't have an answer that would satisfy anyone, least of all herself. But as they reached the cottage and she saw the smoke still rising from the crash site, she knew someone would come. Looking soon, the root cellar was dark and cool, smelling of earth and old potatoes. She helped him down the wooden steps, settling him on a pile of moth-eaten blankets she'd found in the bottom of her mother's trunk. His breathing was still labored, but his color was better. "Water," she said, "and bandages. I'll be back." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her at the threshold. "What is your name?" She hesitated, one foot on the bottom step. Names had power, her grandmother used to say. Once you knew someone's name, you could never completely unknow them. "Marianne," she said finally. "I am Klaus," he replied. "Klaus Richter." The name settled between them like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples in all directions. Marianne nodded once and climbed the steps, pulling the heavy wooden door closed behind her. As she stood in her kitchen, hands shaking as she gathered supplies, she could hear voices in the distance. Men calling to each other, probably searching for the crash site. The home guard, most likely, or perhaps soldiers from the garrison town 20 miles south. They would find the wreckage, of course, but would they assume the pilot had died in the crash? Or would they search every barn, every cellar, every shadow until they found their prize? Outside, the voices grew closer, and Marian pressed her back against the kitchen door, a basin of water trembling in her hands. She had saved an enemy pilot's life, and now she was trapped in a web of her own weaving. But as she thought of those pale blue eyes, wide with fear and pain, she found she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Not yet, anyway. The sound of boots on her front porch made her freeze, the basin slipping from her nerveless fingers to shatter. On the stone floor, the sharp rap of knuckles against wood echoed through the cottage like gunshots. Marian stared at the shattered porcelain scattered across the floor, her mind blank with terror. Water spread in dark fingers across the stone, and she watched it seep into the cracks as if it might offer some escape from the nightmare closing around her. "Miss Blackwood." The voice was gruff, familiar. Constable Morrison from the village, a man who'd known her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. "You all right in there?" Heard something break. She forced her voice to remain steady. "Just clumsy with the washing up, Constable. Coming." Her bare feet stepped carefully around the broken china as she made her way to the door. Each shard caught the afternoon light like tiny mirrors, reflecting fragments of her face back at her. Eyes too wide, skin too pale. The face of a woman harboring secrets. When she opened the door, Morrison stood on the threshold with two soldiers she didn't recognize. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces hard with the particular wariness of men who had seen too much death. Behind them, smoke still rose from the direction of the crash site. "Afternoon, miss," Morrison said, touching the brim of his cap. His weathered face was kind but troubled. "Sorry to disturb, but we're conducting searches of all properties in the area. Had an enemy aircraft come down not far from here." "Enemy aircraft?" Marian let just the right amount of surprise color her voice. "I heard the crash, of course. Shook the whole house. But I assumed German reconnaissance plane." One of the soldiers interrupted, his accent crisp with authority. "Lieutenant Hartwell, according to the insignia on his collar. Pilot's body wasn't found in the wreckage. Could have been thrown clear, might be wandering about injured. Dangerous man, Mississippi. If you've seen anything unusual." Marian shook her head, praying they couldn't hear the thunder of her heartbeat. "Nothing at all. Just the crash itself." Morrison's eyes were kind but searching. "Your father about? Might want to have a word with him too. He's in the far field, bringing in the last of the wheat." The lie came easier than she'd expected. "Won't be back until dark." "And your mother?" "Resting." That, at least, was true. From upstairs came the faint sound of her mother's voice, singing softly to herself. One of the old songs from before the sickness took hold of her mind. Lieutenant Hartwell stepped forward, his pale eyes scanning the cottage interior over her shoulder. "Mind if we have a look around? Standard procedure, you understand." Her mouth went dry as chalk. "Of course." The next few minutes stretched like hours. She watched them move through her home with military efficiency, checking cupboards, peering behind furniture, their boots loud on the wooden floors. One of them even climbed to the loft, his footsteps creaking overhead. Mary Ann stood frozen by the kitchen door, fighting the urge to glance toward the back garden where the cellar entrance lay hidden beneath the climbing roses. What happened? Here, Lieutenant Hartwell knelt beside the broken basin, studying the scattered porcelain. I dropped it when you knocked, Mary Ann said. Startled me, I'm afraid. He picked up a shard, turning it over in his gloved fingers. Jumpy are we? Wouldn't you be? Finding out there's a German pilot loose in the countryside. She let a tremor into her voice, not entirely feigned. A woman alone, with her mother ill. Morrison shot the lieutenant a warning look. Now then, no need to frighten the girl. More than she already is. But Hartwell wasn't finished. Curious thing about that crash, he said, still examining the broken china. Pilot's parachute was deployed, but we found it tangled in trees half a mile from the wreckage. Suggests he survived the initial impact, possibly even walked away from it. Mary Ann's throat constricted. Walked away. Oh yes. An injured man. Miss Blackwood, they need help. Water, bandages, food. They get desperate. Sometimes they take risks, approach isolated farmhouses. You're frightening her, Lieutenant. Morrison said firmly. The officer smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just want to make sure she understands the danger. German pilot, trained killer, possibly armed. If he came here seeking aid, the natural feminine instinct might be to offer Christian charity. But that would be a fatal mistake. Each word felt like a physical blow. Mary Ann nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. They finished their search. Without incident. But as they prepared to leave, Morrison paused on the threshold. Keep your doors locked tonight, Mississippi. And if you see or hear anything at all, you send word immediately. Promise me. I promise, she whispered. She watched from the window as they made their way down the lane, their voices carrying on the autumn air. Only when they disappeared around the bend did she allow herself to breathe freely. The broken basin could wait. She gathered fresh water, strips of clean linen torn from an old sheet, and what remained of the precious jar of honey her neighbor Mrs. Chun had given her. Good for wounds, the old woman had said with a knowing wink. The cellar was darker now. Afternoon shadows stretching long fingers across the earthen floor. Klaus lay exactly where she'd left him, but his eyes were open, alert. He'd heard the voices overhead, she realized, had understood the danger. Soldiers, she said simply, kneeling beside him with her supplies. Looking for me. It wasn't a question. She nodded anyway, then began examining his injured arm. The bone wasn't broken, thank God, but the shoulder was badly wrenched and there were cuts that needed tending. This will hurt, she warned, reaching for the honey. He gritted his teeth as she cleaned the wounds, but made no sound beyond sharp intakes of breath. His skin was warm under her fingers, startlingly human. She'd expected something different, she realized. Something that would mark him as other, as enemy. Instead, he bled red like anyone else. Why did you not tell them? He asked quietly as she worked up. Mary Ann's hand stilled. It was the question she'd been dreading, the one she couldn't answer satisfactorily even to herself. I don't know, she said finally. You could have earned a reward. Recognition. They spoke of me as dangerous. Are you? She looked up into his pale eyes. Dangerous. Something flickered across his features. Pain, or perhaps regret. I was a pilot. I followed orders. Dropped bombs on targets I was told were military installations. His voice grew quieter. But sometimes, in war, the lines blur. Sometimes, innocent people. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The weight of unspoken guilt hung between them like incense, heavy and choking. My brother Thomas, Mary Ann said, surprising herself. He was a good man. Kind. To animals, gentle with children. But he marched off to war and never came home. I used to wonder what he became in those final months. Whether war changed him into something I wouldn't recognize. Klaus was quiet for a long moment. What happened to him? Killed at Passchendaele. His last letter. She paused, remembering. He wrote about the mud. How it got into everything, your clothes, your food, your dreams. Said it was like the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. I'm sorry. The simple words, spoken with genuine feeling, nearly undid her. She busied herself with the bandages, winding them carefully around his shoulder. The lieutenant was right, you know, she said, about the feminine instinct for charity. My grandmother always said it would be my downfall, too soft-hearted for my own good. And yet here I am, alive because of it. Here you are, she agreed. Though for how long, I can't say. They'll be back. Tonight, tomorrow. They won't give up easily. Klaus struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. Then I should go? Now, before I bring more danger to your door. Go where? Marianne's voice was sharper than she'd intended. You can barely stand, let alone walk. There are search parties combing every inch of the countryside. You wouldn't make it a mile. Better than staying here, putting you at risk. That's not your decision to make. They stared at each other in the dim cellar light, and Marianne felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, or the first tentative threads of trust being woven. Tell me about yourself, she said suddenly. Your family, your life. Before all this. Klaus looked surprised by the request. Why? Because if I'm going to risk everything to keep you alive, I'd like to know who I'm saving. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. My father was a professor of literature at the University of Munich. My mother plays piano, teaches music to the children of diplomats and businessmen. I have a younger sister, Greta, who wants to be a doctor but isn't allowed because she's female. His expression softened. She's stubborn as a mule and twice as clever as me. What did you study? Before the war. Architecture. I wanted to build things, create something beautiful that would last. He gestured ruefully at his bandaged arm. Instead, I learned to destroy. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here was a man who had dreamed of creation, forced into a machine of destruction, now dependent on the mercy of someone whose country he had been taught to see as enemy. My turn, Klaus said. Tell me about Marianne Blackwood. She found herself talking more freely than she had in months. About her love of books, smuggled home from the traveling library. About her mother's illness, the gradual fading of the vibrant woman who had once danced through their cottage singing folk songs. About her father's stubborn pride and gentle heart. About the loneliness of being young in a world where all the young men had marched away to die. You never married? Klaus asked. There was someone, she admitted. James Whitmore. We were to be wed last spring, but, she shrugged. He enlisted instead. Died at Verdun 3 months later. I'm sorry. He was a good man. Kind, steady. The sort of man who would have given me a comfortable life, children, security. She was quiet for a moment. I thought I loved him. But you didn't. I don't know. How can you tell the difference between love and the idea of love? Between wanting someone and wanting the life they represent? It was a question that had haunted her for months, and she was surprised to find herself voicing it to this stranger, this enemy. In the darkness of her family's root cellar, Klaus was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, perhaps that's what war takes from us, in the end. Not just lives, but the luxury of time to discover such things. Outside, darkness was falling. Soon her father would return from the fields, tired and hungry. She would need to prepare supper, tend to her mother, play the role of dutiful daughter while harboring a secret that could destroy them all. But for now, in this moment, she sat in the gathering dusk with a man who should have been her enemy and felt more understood than she had in years. The sound of her father's voice calling her name from the cottage above made them both freeze, and Marianne realized with dawning horror that she had lost track of time completely. Marianne, girl, where are you? Her father's voice carried the particular edge of a man who'd worked since dawn and expected his supper waiting. There's broken crockery all over the kitchen floor. She pressed a finger to her lips, meeting Klaus's eyes in the dim cellar light. He nodded understanding, settling back against the earthen wall as she gathered the medical supplies with hands that trembled only slightly. Coming, Papa, she called, her voice carrying up through the wooden planks. Just checking the root vegetables. It was a thin excuse, but it bought her precious seconds to compose herself. She climbed the cellar steps on unsteady legs, emerging into the twilight garden where the roses had begun their autumn dormancy. The cottage windows glowed warm yellow in the gathering darkness, and she could see her father's silhouette moving about the kitchen. Henry Blackwood was a man carved from Yorkshire stone, weathered, enduring, shaped by decades of coaxing life. From stubborn soil. When Marianne slipped through the back door, he was kneeling beside the shattered basin, collecting the larger pieces of porcelain in his broad palms. What happened here, lass? I dropped it, she said, which was at least partially true. When the soldiers came by, his head snapped up, sharp eyes studying her face. Soldiers. She told him about the search, the crashed German plane, the missing pilot. With each word, she watched her father's expression grow darker, the lines around his eyes deepening with worry. They think he's still alive? Henry rose to his feet, porcelain fragments clinking as he deposited them in the waste bin. It seems so. They warned me to keep the doors locked, to send word if I saw anything unusual. Her father was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window toward the fields where he'd spent the day harvesting their meager crop. Finally, dangerous times, Marianne. More dangerous than when I was your age. She busied herself preparing his supper, cold mutton, bread, the last of the summer preserves, while he washed the day's grime from his hands and face. From upstairs came the sound of her mother's voice, singing softly to herself in the gathering darkness. "How is she today?" Henry asked, glancing toward the ceiling. "The same, perhaps a little more agitated." The crash unsettled her. He nodded grimly. Margaret Blackwood's mind had been failing gradually for 2 years now, retreating into a private world of memories and shadows. Some days she recognized them. Others, she spoke to people who existed only in her fevered imagination. The doctors in the village could do nothing but prescribe rest and pray that time might heal what medicine could not touch. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the soft scrape of knife against plate and the distant call of an owl. Hunting in the darkness. Marian found herself listening for any sound from the cellar, but Klaus remained blessedly quiet. "I'll be checking the locks before bed," her father said as he pushed back from the table. "This business with the German pilot has me uneasy. A desperate man might try anything." Marianne's throat constricted. "Of course, Papa." She watched him make his rounds, testing the latches on windows, sliding the heavy wooden bar across the front door, checking that the shotgun above the mantel was loaded and ready. Each precaution felt like another weight settling on her chest, making it harder to breathe. When he finally climbed the stairs to check on her mother, Marian slipped back to the cellar with food wrapped in a kitchen towel and a cup of weak tea. Klaus was exactly where she'd left him, though she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his good hand was clenched into a fist. "Your father?" he asked quietly. "Suspicious by nature, but he doesn't suspect anything yet." She settled beside him, unwrapping the modest meal. "Eat. You need to keep your strength up." He accepted the food gratefully, though she noticed he ate sparingly. A man accustomed to rationing, perhaps, or simply someone who understood that accepting charity came with its own burden of guilt. "Tell me about the mission," she said suddenly. "The one that brought you here." Klaus paused, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. "Why?" "Because I need to understand what I've gotten myself into. The soldiers seemed particularly keen to find you. Not just any pilot, you specifically." Something flickered in his pale eyes. Guilt, or perhaps fear. He set down the bread, his appetite apparently vanished. "I cannot tell you that. Cannot. Or will not. Both." His voice was quiet but firm. "Some secrets are too dangerous to share." Marianne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool cellar air. "What kind of secrets?" Klaus was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The kind that get people killed." She stared at him in the dim light, seeing him truly for perhaps the first time. Not just an injured enemy pilot, but a man carrying burdens she couldn't begin to imagine. The careful way he held himself, the haunted quality in his eyes, the automatic wariness when she asked direct questions. These weren't the traits of an ordinary reconnaissance pilot. "Who are you really?" she asked. "I told you. Klaus Richter, pilot in the Luftwaffe. That's what you are, not who you are." He met her gaze steadily, and she saw something crack in his careful composure. "Some days, I'm not certain there's a difference. Anymore." The admission hung between them like smoke, heavy with unspoken implications. Marianne found herself thinking of Lieutenant Hartwell's words. Dangerous man, trained killer, possibly armed. Had she been naive to trust this stranger based on nothing more than fear in his eyes and the echo of her own losses? "The reconnaissance story," she said slowly. "That's not true, is it?" Klaus's silence was answer enough. "Then what were you really doing over English airspace?" For a moment, She thought he might continue his stubborn refusal to answer. Then something seemed to break inside him, and the words came tumbling out like water through a broken dam. I was running. The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. Running from what? From them. From orders I couldn't follow anymore. From a war machine that has forgotten what it means to be human. His voice grew bitter. Do you know what they call pilots like me? The ones who refuse certain missions? Cowards. Traitors. We disappear in the night, and our families receive letters expressing regret for our accidents. Marianne's mind raced, trying to process the implications. You deserted. Yes. The word was barely audible. 2 days ago, I was given orders to bomb a refugee camp outside Dover. Women and children fleeing the fighting in Belgium. My commanding officer called it a legitimate military target because there might be enemy agents hidden among the civilians. Her blood turned to ice. And you refused. I refused. That night, I stole a plane and flew west, hoping to reach Ireland, then perhaps America. But the fuel ran low, and he gestured weakly at his bandaged shoulder. Here I am. The full weight of what he was telling her crashed down like an avalanche. Not just an enemy pilot, but a deserter. A man whose own country would shoot him, on sight, whose presence here could be seen as treason by both sides of the conflict. Dear God, she whispered, they'll kill you if they find you. Your own people and ours. Yes. And anyone who helped you, yes. The cellar suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. Marian thought of her father upstairs, checking locks and loading shotguns to protect them from the very danger she had invited into their home. Of her mother, lost in her own fragile world, dependent on them for everything. Of the life she had built here, quiet and safe and predictable, all of it balanced now on the edge of a knife. Why didn't you tell me this before, she asked. Would it have changed anything? She considered the question seriously. Would it have? If she had known from the beginning that he was a deserter, that helping him made her complicit in treason against both nations, I don't know, she said finally. I told myself I was protecting you, that what you didn't know couldn't hurt you. Klaus's laugh was bitter as winter wind. But that was a lie. I was protecting myself. From your judgment. From the possibility that you might see me as the coward they say I am. Are you, she asked. Quietly. A coward. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his bandaged hands. I used to think courage meant following orders without question, flying into enemy fire without flinching. But watching those refugees stream past our airfield, women carrying babies, old men leaning on walking sticks, and knowing I was ordered to kill them. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Perhaps the greatest courage is knowing when to say no. Marianne thought of Thomas, marching off to war with such bright certainty. Of James Whitmore, killed at Verdun fighting for king and country. Of all the young men who had followed orders unto death, never questioning whether those orders were worth their lives. There's something else, Klaus said, his voice barely audible. Something you need to know before you decide whether to keep helping me. A new kind of dread settled in her stomach. What? The mission I refused, the refugee camp bombing. It wasn't random. I had access to high-level intelligence. Strategic information about Allied positions, supply lines, planned offensives. His voice grew quieter with each word. My father may be a literature professor, but my mother's brother is Colonel Heinrich Richter of the General Staff. I know. Things, Marianne. Things that could change the course of this war. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Not just a deserter, but a deserter with military secrets. The kind of secrets that nations would kill for, that men like Lieutenant Hartwell would stop at nothing to obtain. That's why they want you so badly, she breathed. Yes, and why I can never go back. To anyone. Klaus's eyes were haunted in the dim light. I am a man without a country now, carrying secrets too dangerous to keep and too valuable to discard. Do you understand what that means for you? For your family? She understood perfectly. By saving him, by hiding him, she had stepped into the middle of a web of international intrigue that stretched far beyond their quiet valley. The war had found them at last, not through bombs or soldiers, but through one broken man seeking redemption. I don't care, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Klaus stared at her. You don't understand, I understand. Perfectly. She reached out, covering his unbandaged hand with hers. You chose conscience over duty. You chose mercy over orders. Whatever secrets you carry, whatever danger comes with them, I've already made my choice too. In the darkness above them, her father's footsteps creaked across the kitchen floor, checking the locks one final time before bed. Soon the cottage would settle into sleep, and she would be alone with her secret, her choice, her deserter pilot, who carried the weight of war in his wounded hands. But as Klaus squeezed her fingers in gratitude, neither of them heard the soft footsteps outside the cellar door or saw the shadow that had been listening to every word they'd spoken. The cellar door crashed open like thunder, flooding the earthen chamber with lamplight that cut through the darkness like a blade. Marianne threw herself protectively in front of Klaus, her heart hammering against her ribs as a figure descended the wooden steps with measured, deliberate footfalls. But it wasn't Lieutenant Hartwell or the home guard that it was her father, Henry. Blackwood stood at the bottom of the steps, oil lamp held high, his weathered face a mask of granite fury and crushing disappointment. Behind him, the autumn night pressed close and cold, carrying the distant sound of voices, searchers still combing the countryside. "Papa," Marianne whispered, the word cracking like ice. 37 years I've lived in this valley," Henry said, his voice low and terrible. 37 years of honest work, honest living. Built a reputation on my word, on doing right by my neighbors. His eyes never left Klaus's face. "And my daughter brings shame on our name by harboring the enemy in our very cellar." Klaus struggled to sit straighter despite his injuries, meeting the older man's gaze without flinching. "Sir, your daughter saved my life. Any shame belongs to me alone." "Aye, it does." Henry's voice could have cut glass. German pilot. Deserter. Carrying military secrets. He'd heard everything, Marianne realized with sinking horror. Every damning word. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" "She showed mercy to a wounded man," Klaus said quietly. "In my country, we would call that Christian virtue." "Christian virtue?" Henry's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Tell that to Lieutenant Hartwell when he returns with his men. Tell that to the magistrate when they try my daughter for treason." The word hung between them like a physical thing, sharp-edged and poisonous. Treason. The charge that meant death or transportation, that would destroy not just Marianne, but anyone connected to her. Her mother, already lost in the labyrinth of her own mind, would be sent to an asylum. There, land would be forfeit. Everything their family had built across generations would crumble to dust. "There's still time," Henry said, his voice gentler now, but no less firm. "I can walk to the village, bring back the constable. Tell them I discovered you here, that Marianne knew nothing. A clever lie might save her yet." "No." The word tore from Marianne's throat before she could stop it. "Papa, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." His eyes were hard as flint. "I understand that you've let your soft heart override your common sense. I understand that you've chosen a stranger over your own family. He's not just any stranger." Desperation made her voice rise. "He refused to bomb refugee children. He gave up everything rather than follow orders that violated his conscience. How can we punish a man for choosing mercy? Because mercy is a luxury we cannot afford." Henry's composure cracked, revealing the fear beneath his anger. "This is war, girl. In war, you protect your own first, last, and always. That's how families survive." Klaus shifted beside her, and she felt him gathering himself despite his injuries. "Mr. Blackwood is right," he said quietly. "I should never have let you help me. The risk to your family. Don't you dare." Marianne turned on him, fury blazing in her chest. "Don't you dare try to make this decision for me. I'm not a child to be protected from the consequences of my choices. Then act like an adult and make the right choice." Henry's voice cracked like a whip. "One man's life against the safety of everyone you claim to love. Your mother upstairs, depending on us for her very survival. Our neighbors who'll be branded traitors by association. Me, who'll swing from a gibbet for harboring enemies of the crown." The weight of his words settled on her shoulders like stones, pressing down until she could barely breathe. He was right, of course. The practical, sensible choice was clear. One life against many. One stranger against family. But as she looked at Klaus, pale, wounded, carrying secrets that might save innocent lives, she couldn't bring herself to see it as simple arithmetic. "There has to be another way," she whispered. "There is." Klaus's voice was steady, resolved. "I leave. Tonight." Whatever happens to me after that is not your burden to bear. You can barely stand. I'll manage. The search parties will find you within hours. Perhaps, or perhaps not. He met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her heart clench, gratitude, regret, and beneath it all, a bone-deep weariness. But at least your family will be safe. Henry nodded grimly. The lad shows sense. Better one death than many. But even as he spoke, the sound of voices outside grew closer, and through the open cellar door came the distant glow of torches. The search parties were converging on their area, drawn perhaps by some clue they'd missed, some sign that pointed toward the Blackwood cottage. Too late, Henry muttered, his face going pale. They're coming. Marianne's mind raced, calculating distances and possibilities. The cottage was surrounded by open fields on three sides, offering no cover for an injured man trying to escape. The fourth side bordered the river, but the banks were steep and treacherous, especially in darkness. The old smuggler's tunnel, she said suddenly. Both men stared at her. What? Henry demanded. The tunnel grandfather used during the revenue wars. It starts in the far corner of the cellar, runs under the river, comes up in Widow Morrison's barn on the far side. Her words tumbled over each other in excitement. I found it when I was 12, exploring. The entrance is hidden behind that loose stone. Henry's eyes widened. That tunnel was sealed decades ago. The entrance was sealed. The tunnel itself. She shrugged. I crawled through it once, just to see. It's narrow, but passable for someone slim. Klaus struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. How far? Quarter mile, perhaps less. But you're injured, and it's been years since I'll manage. His voice carried quiet determination. But if I'm caught in the tunnel, the connection to your family becomes even clearer. You must be able to deny any knowledge. Then you'll need a guide. Marian stood as well, her decision crystallizing like ice. Someone who knows the way. Absolutely not. Henry's voice brooked no argument. I forbid it. You cannot forbid what I choose freely, Papa. Father and daughter stared at each other. Across a gulf that had opened like a chasm between them. Two generations, two ways of seeing the world. Henry, shaped by decades of careful survival, of protecting what was his and asking no questions about the broader world. Marianne, young enough to still believe that individual choices mattered, that mercy was worth the risk. You'll kill us all with your stubbornness, Henry said finally, or save us all with it. The voices outside were definitely closer now, and through the cellar door came the unmistakable sound of boots on gravel. Lieutenant Hartwell's crisp accent cut through the night air. Check every outbuilding, every root cellar. He's here somewhere. Henry closed his eyes, aging 10 years in as many seconds. When he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. 5 minutes, he said quietly. I'll give you 5 minutes to reach the tunnel before I go out to meet them. Tell them I heard noises, came to investigate, found signs someone had been here, but left again. Marianne felt tears prick her eyes. Papa, 5 minutes, he repeated firmly. After that, you're on your own. Klaus grasped the older man's hand briefly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, lad. Thank me when you're both alive to see sunrise. Marianne led Klaus to the far corner of the cellar, her hands shaking as she felt along the wall for the loose stone she remembered from childhood adventures. There, a section that shifted slightly under pressure, revealing a dark opening barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Can you manage this? She asked, studying Klaus's injured shoulder. I have to. She went first, crawling on hands and knees into the narrow tunnel that smelled of earth and ancient secrets. Behind her, Klaus followed with painful slowness, his breathing harsh in the confined space. The tunnel seemed smaller than she remembered, pressing close around them like a grave. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead, and the air grew thick and stale. Her dress caught on rough stone, tearing with soft ripping sounds that seemed impossibly loud. Klaus's labored breathing echoed off the tunnel walls, punctuated by occasional gasps of pain when his injured shoulder scraped against the stones. How much farther, he whispered. Halfway, maybe more. She could feel his strength failing, hear it in the way his breathing grew more ragged with each yard they covered. Klaus, if you can't, I can. But she could hear the lie in his voice, feel the tremor in his movements as exhaustion and pain took their toll. Behind them, Faintly came the sound of voices in the cellar they'd just left. Her father, speaking in calm, measured tones to Lieutenant Hartwell's sharp questions. The tunnel began to slope upward, a sign they were approaching. The far side. Marianne's knees were raw, her palms scraped and bleeding from the rough stone. Klaus had fallen further behind, his breathing coming in shallow pants that spoke of a man pushed beyond his limits. There, she whispered, seeing a faint square of starlight ahead, the entrance to Morrison's barn. But as they approached the opening, her heart sank. The old wooden cover had partially collapsed, leaving an opening barely large enough for a child. Klaus would never fit through, not with his injured shoulder and larger frame. "I'll have to widen it," she said, examining the rotted wood. "Too much noise. They'll hear." He was right. Any attempt to break away more of the cover would echo across the water, alerting the search parties to their location. They were trapped between impossibility ahead and certain capture behind. "Wait here," Marianne said suddenly. "I can fit through. Let me scout the area, see if there's another way." Before Klaus could protest, she squeezed through the narrow opening into the barn beyond. The space was dark and filled with the scent of old hay and mouse droppings. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, creating a lattice of silver and shadow. She was searching for tools, anything that might help widen the tunnel entrance quietly, when she heard voices outside. Male voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized one of them. Lieutenant Hartwell. "Search every building on this side of the river," he was saying. "If the German pilot is wounded as badly as the wreckage suggests, he can't have gone far. Someone is helping him." Footsteps approached the barn, crunching on the gravel path. In moments, they would discover the tunnel entrance, would find Klaus trapped like a rabbit in a burrow. And when they did, the trail would lead straight back to her family. Marianne looked around desperately, her mind racing through impossible calculations. 3 soldiers outside, maybe more. Klaus wounded and exhausted in the tunnel behind her. No weapons, no escape route, no way to warn him of the approaching danger. Then her eyes fell on the old hay bales stacked near the barn's rear wall, and suddenly she had a plan. Desperate, dangerous, with almost no chance of success, but it was the only option left. She began pulling hay from the nearest bale, scattering it across the barn floor in a trail that led away from the tunnel entrance toward the far corner. Then she struck a match from the bundle in her pocket, her hands steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The hay caught quickly, flames licking hungrily at the dry fodder. In seconds, the trail of fire raced across the barn floor, consuming everything in its path. Smoke began to fill the air, thick and choking. Outside, she heard shouts of alarm. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" As chaos erupted beyond the walls and heavy footsteps pounded toward the blaze, Marianne dove back through the tunnel opening, praying she had bought them enough time to escape, and knowing that her act of arson had just made her a criminal in the eyes of both armies. Smoke poured through the tunnel opening as Marianne crawled frantically back to Klaus, her lungs burning with each breath. Behind her, the barn erupted in a symphony of destruction, crackling flames, splintering wood, and the shouts of soldiers abandoning their search to fight the fire. "What did you do?" Klaus gasped as she reached him, his face pale with pain and exhaustion. "Bought us time." She grasped his good arm, helping him struggle forward through the narrow passage. "The tunnel opens into the riverbank 20 yards downstream. If we can reach it while they're distracted." The next few minutes blurred together in a nightmare of scraping stone and labored breathing. Klaus's strength was failing rapidly, his injured shoulder grinding against the tunnel walls with each agonizing yard. Behind them, orange light flickered through the opening they'd left, and the acrid smell of burning hay grew stronger. When they finally emerged into the night air beside the river, Klaus collapsed onto the muddy bank, his chest heaving. Above them, the barn blazed like a beacon against the dark sky, casting dancing shadows across the water. Soldiers shouted orders, their voices carrying on the autumn wind as they formed bucket brigades to contain the blaze. "Can you walk?" Marianne whispered, scanning the landscape for cover. Klaus struggled to his knees, then to his feet, swaying like a tree in a storm. "Where?" She pointed upstream, where a copse of willows overhung the water. "There. We can follow the riverbank." Stay hidden until we're clear of the search area. It was slow going. Klaus leaned heavily on her shoulder, his boots slipping on the wet stones, his breathing harsh and labored. Every few yards they had to stop, pressing against the bank while search parties with torches swept the opposite shore. The fire had drawn most of the soldiers away from their systematic search, but patrols still moved through the darkness like hunting wolves by dawn. They had covered perhaps 2 miles, following the river as it wound through countryside that grew wilder and more remote with each step. The smoke from Morrison's barn had long since faded behind them, but Marianne could still taste it on her tongue. The bitter flavor of bridges burned and choices made. They found shelter in an abandoned shepherd's hut, its roof partially collapsed, but its walls still solid enough to provide concealment. Klaus collapsed onto a pile of moldering hay, his face gray with exhaustion and pain. His shoulder was bleeding again, seeping through the makeshift bandages. Rest, Marian said, though. She knew they couldn't stay long. By now, the soldiers would have finished fighting the fire and resumed their search. It would only be a matter of time before they found the tunnel, traced their path along the riverbank. Your family, Klaus said quietly. Will they be safe? Marianne considered the question honestly. Her father was clever, respected in the community. He would tell his story with conviction, that he'd heard noises in the cellar, investigated, found signs of an intruder, but arrived too late. The burned barn would be blamed on vagrant scavengers, perhaps, or simple accident. It might work. Papa will manage, she said finally. He's survived worse storms than this. But even as she spoke the words, she felt the weight of what she'd given up settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Home, family, the life she'd known, all of it left behind in a root cellar that smelled of earth and secrets. She was a fugitive now, branded a traitor by association, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to except the wounded enemy pilot who'd upended her world. I'm sorry, Klaus said, as if reading her thoughts. You've lost everything because of me. No. She settled beside him on the hay, studying his pale, pain-etched features in the dim light. I've lost one life, perhaps, but I might have found another. He turned to look at her, something shifting in his pale eyes. What will you do when I'm gone? The question hung between them like morning mist, fragile and ephemeral. What would she do? She couldn't return home, not safely. Couldn't live openly in any English town or village. The war had made her a woman without a country, just as it had made him a man without one. I don't know, she admitted. Find work somewhere they don't ask too many questions. Take a new name, a new story. Survive. Alone. The single word carried more weight than she'd expected. Alone. Yes, that seemed to be her fate now, to wander through the world without roots, without connections, without the anchor of family and place that had defined her entire life. Unless the intelligence you carry, she said suddenly. The military secrets. You said they could change the course of the war. Klaus nodded carefully. Allied troop movements, supply schedules, planned offensives. Information my unit gathered for targets that I couldn't bring myself to strike. Then deliver it. He stared at her. What? Find a way to pass the information to the Allied command. Anonymously, safely. Let it save the lives you couldn't save by following those orders. They would never trust intelligence from a German deserter. Then don't. Tell them where it came from. Marianne's mind was racing now, seeing possibilities where before there had been only despair. Leave it where it will be found. Mail it to a newspaper. Find some way to get it into the right hands without revealing yourself. Klaus was quiet for a long moment, turning the idea over in his mind. It might work, he said slowly. But afterward, I would still be a man without a country, still hunted by both sides. Not necessarily. She leaned forward, excitement building in her chest. What if you weren't Klaus Richter anymore? What if that man died in the plane crash, and someone else, someone with different papers, a different story, survived? False identity papers are almost impossible to obtain. Not impossible. Difficult, expensive, dangerous, but not impossible. She was thinking of stories she'd heard whispered in the village, of French resistance networks that specialized in creating new lives for those who needed them. There are people who help refugees, displaced persons, for the right price, in the right circumstances. And you? Klaus asked quietly. In this fantasy where I become someone else, where do you fit? The question she'd been avoiding crystallized in the cold morning air. Where did she fit? In a world remade by war and loss, where old certainties crumbled like autumn leaves, what did she want her life to become? Maybe I become someone else too, she said softly. Maybe we both disappear, and two other people, people with no history, no past, no enemies, find each other somewhere the war hasn't reached. Klaus reached out with his good hand, covering hers with fingers that were warm despite everything they'd endured. America, he said. I have had a cousin who emigrated before the war. New York. He wrote once about a place where a man's past mattered less than his willingness to work. A place to start over. A place to start over. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the abandoned hut and filling it with golden light. Outside, birds were singing, the first time Marianne had noticed them in days. Life continuing despite war, despite human folly, despite all the reasons it shouldn't. It won't be easy, Klaus said finally. No, it will be dangerous, expensive, probably impossible. We might not survive the attempt. We might not survive staying here either. He squeezed her hand gently. Then we try. We try. The decision, once made, felt both terrifying and liberating. To abandon everything familiar, to trust their lives to strangers and forged papers, and the slim hope that somewhere across an ocean lay safety. It was madness that IT was also the only sane choice left to them. They spent the day planning, sharing what little they knew about resistance networks and escape routes. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Klaus produced a small leather notebook from his jacket, the one containing the military intelligence that had cost him everything. For the Allied command, he said, pressing it into her hands. Whatever happens to us, this information needs to reach them. Marianne tucked the notebook into her bodice, feeling its weight against her heart like a talisman. So many secrets, so many lives that might be saved or lost, depending on what they did with the knowledge it contained. As evening approached, they prepared to leave the shepherd's hut and continue their journey toward the coast, toward contacts Klaus thought might exist, toward a future that remained stubbornly uncertain. But as they stepped out into the gathering dusk, Marianne paused. There, growing wild beside the ruined hut, was a single rosebush. Its leaves were brown with autumn's touch, its branches bare and seemingly lifeless. But at its heart, impossibly, bloomed one perfect white rose, late-season beauty defying the onset of winter. She plucked the flower carefully, tucking it into her hair. Klaus watched with something that might have been wonder. What made you choose that one? He asked. It reminded me of something my grandmother used to say. Marianne adjusted the rose's position, feeling its petals soft against her cheek. That hope always blooms where you least expect it, if you have eyes to see. They walked into the darkening countryside hand in hand, two people who had lost everything and found each other in the wreckage. Behind them, smoke still rose faintly from the burned barn, marking the end of one story. Ahead, the lights of distant villages twinkled like stars, promising the beginning of another. The war would end eventually, as all wars did. But whatever came after, whatever new world rose from the ashes of the old, they would face it together, carrying hope like a white rose blooming against impossible odds. If this tale of love found in the darkest of times has moved your heart, dear friends, share it with those who believe that mercy can triumph over hatred, that courage can bloom even in winter's deepest freeze. And remember, sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose compassion over fear, hope over despair.